Okay, well, I'm Umesh Lalloo. I'm going to talk on TB in South Africa. So, Dr. Christopher, thank you very much for that insight, and I think we share most of the sentiments. In fact, I remember when Bono was giving a talk on TB and HIV, and the audience gave him an applause. So he said, every time I clap, one person in the world dies from TB. So somebody in the audience got up and said, well, why don't you stop clapping? Okay, so I'm going to give you an insight into TB in South Africa, and I think most of what you heard earlier rings true for us, in fact worse, because South Africa's population, as I told you last night, is 56 million. It's 20 times higher in the population, 20 times lower than the population in India. Yet we probably have 20 times worse problem. Okay, so well, let's get. So does anybody know who this man is? I've asked this question before, and I think Rajiv was there, so he's not allowed to answer. Anyone else knows?
Robert Koch.
Robert Koch, who said that? No, you weren't supposed to answer. Okay, but it just goes to, the reason I'm putting it up here is not because I want to test your general knowledge, but I just want to remind you that the origins of pulmonology was in tuberculosis. In fact, the American Thoracic Society, which I think was the first respiratory society in the world, started because of tuberculosis. And insidiously over the century, they forgot about tuberculosis and got interested in the more what they call sexy diseases like COPD and asthma and interstitial lung disease and pulmonary alveolar proteinosis, which is of no consequence to us. And we forgot that our roots lie in TB. And what's interesting is that it's done a full circle, and I think all of us around the world, even if you think you belong in a country that doesn't have a high TB incidence, you will be affected and infected. So unless you put in resources and you come to the party, we're going to be in serious trouble, as you heard. So Robert Koch won a Nobel Prize for his work in discovering the acid-fast bacillus. Okay, and you heard that John Bunyan called tuberculosis the white plague. Okay, and I always like to remind the audience to read what he said. And he said, yet the captain of all these men of death that came against him to take him away was consumption. Now consumption is tuberculosis, for it was that brought him down to the grave. And tragically, he said that in 1680. And unfortunately for many of us working in developing countries such as South Africa, India, and various other countries in Africa, this holds true. Despite all the advances, as you heard, we can send somebody into space, but we can't save somebody on Earth. So when you look at South Africa and you look at the top 10 leading causes of death, and if you look from 2013 to 2015, we haven't made too much advances. Despite all the technology, access to drugs, better healthcare. And again, I want to remind you that in Africa, South Africa is the most resourced country. It has the highest number of TB clinics per capita population, yet I'll show you we do much worse than all our neighbors, including Zimbabwe. So if you look at, Professor Xavier Blanc is going to talk about HIV and TB. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but what I want to point out to you that in South Africa and certainly in the province where I live, up to 80% of people who have active tuberculosis are HIV co-infected. So we are dealing in South Africa with a dual epidemic. Now you heard again about the end TB strategy at a glance, and at the moment it's pipe dream for us that whether we're going to achieve this or not. But certainly there is a target set that we would have a reduction of absolute number of TB deaths by 95% by 2035. I'm not sure we're going to see that with the current state of the economy and the commitments of various governments to TB programs, unfortunately. The percentage reduction in the TB incidence rate should be 90%. And I think what's more important is that what we fail to understand that every time one person, particularly an adult, in a developing country world gets tuberculosis, it has catastrophic consequences for the family. And unless we do that, reduce that, I think TB will remain a socio-economic disease that's going to afflict the poor the most. So this is showing what I told you about the dream that we can reduce TB incidence to extremely low. Okay. Now, countries in 3 high burden country lists for TB, HIV and MDR TB that are being used by the WHO between 2016 and 2020 is listed here, and you can see that there's one country that stands out in this Venn diagram that has a burden of tuberculosis, MDR, TB, and TB and HIV, and that is South Africa. Okay. So unfortunately, in South Africa, we have this reputation of being the first with many diseases. So if you look at estimated TB incidence 2016 for countries with at least 100,000 incident cases. Now if you look at South Africa has about 500,000 incident cases in 2016. And if you look at India, you're going to see almost 2.5 million. But in fact, if you then multiply South Africa's population by 20, which is the population of India, you will see that we surpass any country in the world in terms of the number of incident cases per 100,000. So we're really in serious trouble, okay? What about the TB incidence rates in 2016 around the world in relation to South Africa? So you can see that South Africa is dark green. It's listed as more than 300 cases per 100,000. Does anybody like to hesitate and guess what the actual incidence in South Africa is today of tuberculosis? And to put it in perspective, do you know what the TB incidence rate is in the US at the moment? Does anybody have an idea? Anyone wants to hazard a guess? Rajiv, here's your chance to shine. 50? Less than 50. No, that's hedging. You give a number. I'll allow you plus minus 5. About 4 to 6 per 100,000. In South Africa, it is more than 800 per 100,000. So it's really a tragedy. I think it's much lower in India. It's about 300-400. Yeah, so we also beat India hands down, except for soccer, I suppose, and cricket. So I'm not going to go through this. I think you saw this, but I'll just go through this quickly. So the TB incidence rate around the world is listed here, and you can see the trend between 2000 and 2016. Fortunately, the notification of new cases and relapse cases has increased, and the mortality in HIV negative seems to be coming down, but certainly not at any rate at which we'd like it to actually happen, okay? And then if you look at regional differences, now you know the WHO and the UN produced this World TB report. Now what is very misleading in the way the graphs are presented is, if you look at these curves, they all look very similar, but you have to look at the y-axis because the numbers are different. So if you look at Africa, it starts at 400. In America, the axis is between 10 and 40. So you can see that Africa and certainly Southeast Asia lead the world in terms of TB incidence. So you got to look at the y-axis when you interpret these figures. So if you look at the number of estimated deaths caused by TB, which you heard already, you can see that if you look at the HIV deaths, which is shown in black here, okay, you can see that it had gone up, peaked around 2005 or so, and then started coming down. But what's important is that about 1/3 of the deaths from HIV are due to tuberculosis. Okay? But you'll hear more about this shortly, I think, from Professor Xavier Blanc. Now, I want you to put South Africa in perspective. Okay, so if you look at South Africa, and it's, I think you're looking at that slide there, so let me see if I can point there. So if you look at South Africa, you can see that's 1,000, okay? 1,000 per 100,000. You can see that we peaked at about 1,000 per 100,000 around 2008, and we are coming down, but we're still around 800, okay? And then, so that's in green, and obviously the shaded area is the confidence intervals for that figure. So we're still very much in a difficult position. And obviously in red, you can see the number of cases of HIV positive with tuberculosis. So it still represents the greatest burden of TB in South Africa. Okay, so sorry, the one thing I wanted to highlight is the fact that compared to various other countries, and I always use Zimbabwe as a reference because it is regarded as one of the countries in Africa with the poorest economy, poorest growth rate, highest inflation, and yet they have far better TB statistics than we do. Obviously there's explanations for that because half of Zimbabwe's population was in South Africa. Apparently as of last week they're going back, including South Africans. But moreover, and another explanation could be that we have better statistics, which I don't think is an appropriate explanation. So I think in reality, even if you double the rate in Zimbabwe, we are doing really, really badly in South Africa. Okay? So if you look at estimated TB mortality rates, again, in South Africa, you can see from this graph that South Africa carries a disproportionate burden of deaths from tuberculosis. Okay? Now, if you look at ART coverage, and that's antiretroviral treatment in people who are HIV positive with TB, you can see that although South Africa again is highly resourced, you can see that only about 40% of people who have TB and HIV are actually on antiretroviral treatment. So here again, with the dual epidemic, when people who are identified with TB are not getting onto antiretroviral treatment. In fact, the reality should be that if you have TB and HIV, you should be on antiretroviral treatment within 2 weeks. I think you're going to hear more about that. But tragically, that is not happening. And that's why we're driving so much of dual infections in South Africa. But with MDR TB, we're doing better, and there's a good explanation for that, is because South Africa is one of the WHO countries that have been identified for access to bedaquiline and delanamide. So you can see that we are doing a little better in South Africa in terms of the MDR patients who are started on effective treatment for MDR TB. Okay, so this is bedaquiline and delanamide access. South Africa is fortunate, and I suppose the WHO has identified South Africa as a country with the highest burden per capita population, and therefore has given South Africa specific access to these two new anti-TB drugs. And we're actually doing a multinational study sponsored by the US NIH to see if we can considerably reduce the duration of treatment for MDR TB using the combination of these two drugs with other second-line drugs such as moxifloxacin. And so you can see that South Africa is fortunate. But what I want to illustrate in this slide is that in orange are countries that do not have access to bedaquiline. Obviously you see the US there, but they don't need it. They have Trump. So I'm not going to go through this because this is just showing you the sort of trend of mortality and number of patients on treatment in South Africa. So until now, the aim of a good TB control program was that we needed to have 85% cure of newly diagnosed smear-positive cases. So what's the cure rate in South Africa? In the best TB clinic, it was about 30% when I presented it 2 years ago. It's now about 50 to 60%. So we're nowhere near the target that was set by the WHO some decades ago. We need to detect at least 70% of active cases. We hardly ever do any case finding for reasons that are not clear to us, but certainly it's a behavioral thing. And secondly, it's about resources. In other words, when somebody comes in with active TB, nobody is making the effort, the healthcare system is not making the effort to go and trace contacts and treat them. Okay, and then obviously latent TB, we heard about secondary prophylaxis, which is so critical. And certainly in South Africa, we are seeing remarkable success in patients who are HIV infected, who are getting onto antiretroviral treatment, who do not have active TB, are being put on latent TB prophylaxis. So hopefully that's going to work out. Okay, and I think with the newer drugs, rifapentine, we might be able to give. We just finished the study, and we're waiting for the 5-year follow-up to see whether 1 month of treatment with combination with rifapentine might actually reduce the prophylaxis treatment duration to 1 month, which will be remarkable if it's effective. Obviously, there are side effects such as optic neuritis that we are concerned about. So, the South African HIV treatment guidelines, when I presented last, we said that anybody who's got a CD4 count of over 350 must be put onto antiretroviral treatment. Fortunately, that is old news. The current status is, and South Africa has adopted this, that anybody who is HIV positive must be put onto TB treatment, antiretroviral treatment immediately, irrespective of CD4 count. And there's many good reasons for that. One is treatment is prevention. So people who have HIV or an antiretroviral treatment and reconstituted will become less infective if they don't, even if they don't use protection when having sex. So that is a very dramatic stride. Now South Africa has between 5 and 6 million people infected with HIV. To date we have about 2.5 million people on antiretroviral treatment, which means there's about 2.5 to 3 million people that are not yet on treatment. And I can tell you that if that were to happen today, South Africa was already bankrupt, would become more bankrupt. So we would be in serious trouble. So we have a serious problem in South Africa. And the reason to bring that issue up is because we have a big problem with TB, we have a big problem with HIV, and we do not have the resources. Unless we start reducing the number of new cases, we are going to be in serious trouble in South Africa. I'm just going to skip this. I've already given you that data. So you might ask, what's the origins of our TB problem? And I think there's many reasons, many of which is political. So tuberculosis was brought into South Africa by the British when they came here. The British brought the miners to come work in the gold and coal mines. They brought TB with them. And then it spread like wildfire because a lot of the migrant workers who worked on the mines lived in high density accommodation. In fact, the hostels that they lived in, they had an 8-hour shift. So in one room they had 16 people. And every 8 hours it changed staff. So the next shift came and slept and the other shift went to work. And what happened is if one person got TB, it spread it to everyone. So that's how TB spread, and that's how also sexually transmitted diseases, and then more recently HIV spread in the gold mines. And then obviously these miners who worked in the gold mines and went home during the holidays and then took the TB and the HIV and the sexually transmitted diseases back home. So that's how it caught into South Africa. Now in apartheid days, South Africa was divided into South Africa and the homelands. The homelands were where all the indigent black people were located. And when they provided TB statistics, they were not included in the international statistics. So you had a spurious view that TB incidence was very low. When we got our independence, these homelands then fell away and we all became integrated into South Africa. And suddenly the TB incidence rate went up. That was spurious because it was actually high all the time. The statistics were just kept away from the world's view. So that's one explanation. And obviously the other explanation, which holds true in India, I think, is if you look at these pictures that I've shown before, you can see that if one person coughs up acid-fast bacilli, about 12 people in the room will get infected. Okay, this is how the majority of South Africans live. And tragically, this is a scenario we see in our public hospitals all the time in South Africa. And then you see here, this is our medical wards. Now in an average state sector medical ward in South Africa, about 60% of people who are admitted would have TB and HIV. So all you need is one person to have active TB, and the nurse would come there and say, please cough up a sample of sputum. We want to test you for TB. And when he coughs it up, he will then spread it to everybody in the ward because there's poor ventilation. And then we have this other extreme in South Africa where we have about 20% of people who are filthy rich, obese, hypertensive, diabetic and ischemic heart disease, but it costs more to treat this man's ischemic heart disease than it is to provide adequate ventilation in our wards. So that's the paradox in South Africa. Political leadership I discussed at length yesterday, but it is an important issue that we must bear in mind. Civil strife, like we see in South Africa and other African countries, promotes poor health care and in fact undermines the healthcare system, war and poor leadership. In fact, in Kenya, when they had the elections about 8 years ago, during that time of the election-related violence, the HIV incidence rate shot up, which goes to prove that when you have civil strife or war, your healthcare system collapses. And in South Africa, unfortunately, we are in a state of civil strife with our poor economy, with the corruption, and the workers going on strike, and so the healthcare system fails. So if a worker, for example, our mining sector, in the gold mining sector, has the best TB control program probably in the world, highly resourced. But that would collapse immediately the miners go on strike, because then they won't have access to the treatment during the time that they're on strike. So it would sabotage all the gains they've made. Okay. Now in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to give you an idea, this is a glimpse at a TB clinic, and they asked the patient, so why don't you come to collect your TB treatment? What was the reason that you didn't get to the clinic? Because the TB treatment is free in South Africa. About 40% said they didn't have enough money to get to the clinic. Okay? Some patients found it too far to get to the clinic. Others said that if I spent money coming to the TB clinic, then my children won't have food. So it's those simple things that our government has failed to understand, which is driving our TB epidemic in South Africa. So I'm not going to go through this case history, but this is the diagram of leakages. In other words, what I want to illustrate here, and I'm not going to go through it in detail because I've done this before, is when a patient comes to a clinic, they collect a sputum sample. What happens to that sputum sample and what happens to the patient? You will see a litany of errors. The patient does not get an appointment, or the patient doesn't come back to the clinic, or when the patient does come back to the clinic is too busy, they can't access the results, or they can't access the drug resistance results. And that is why so many patients who get diagnosed with TB don't get onto treatment. And when they do get treatment, then they can't come and collect it. And again, I just want to show you this, the duration of time a patient with active TB spends in hospital. Now the problem with that is when you have active TB and you're in a hospital, and I showed you these overcrowded wards, you're increasing the time during which the patient would spread TB. And we've done a very exciting project which we completed a few years ago to show that when you have MDR TB and we discharge the patient home-based care is better than in hospital care in South Africa, because you can provide a safe environment, you provide the patient with masks, and you send the patient home, and the healthcare worker then goes and checks that they take their treatment. Because when we identified the first large epidemic of XDR TB, we found that most of the spread occurred within the hospital. And so it is best that the patient goes home, but when the patient goes home, you need to provide appropriate home-based care and support in order to do that. Professor Deda wrote a review in the Lancet on XDR TB. Most of the patients in South Africa on XDR TB who are incurable are actually out there in the community merrily spreading it. Because we have a human rights charter, we forgot that the public concern should trump individual rights when it comes to conditions like TB. But that's unfortunately a reality in South Africa. We did a study on, and you heard about healthcare workers. So this is the MMed project for one of my students, and we did a project on doctors who get TB. Now in South Africa, we have reported one of the highest incidence rates of tuberculosis amongst healthcare workers. And we questioned doctors about their TB treatment. And in fact, I'm not going to go through the details, but in a nutshell, there was a delay in diagnosis. In other words, from the time the doctor got symptoms to the time they diagnosed active TB took a few months. Then the way the doctor was being treated, now you would imagine that in a society like South Africa, and even anywhere in the world, the doctor in a sense is privileged because they understand medicine. They should have the best access to the best health care, because that's what they would demand. And unfortunately, in the context of TB in South Africa, the doctors are treated badly. Can you imagine what chance the patient would stand who's not a doctor? So it's a serious problem. Okay, from discussion with the patient who's the doctor now about TB, the treatment, the side effects, it fails miserably, and the doctor is actually left on his own. I actually treat myself about 2 doctors a month with active TB. Okay, so this example, I've shown you this before. This is a picture of a medical officer who developed active TB, went to a private clinic, was misdiagnosed as drug-sensitive TB, was treated, but actually had MDR TB, and subsequently died of untreated and complicated MDR TB with tuberculous meningitis. Okay. Now, that was about 10 years ago. We advised this doctor to sue the state, but the family was too upset to do that. Here's a patient I saw last year, 26-year-old doctor in community service in a local secondary care hospital working in the medical wards where 60% of the patients have active TB and HIV. She presented with cough, fever, weight loss. 2 months later, she was referred to me. Chest X-ray showed consolidation. I did a bronchoscopy and diagnosed MDR TB. She was treated. Now the problem is, this is the kind of clinic in which she worked. Okay. And in fact, this is a study we did some years ago, about 10 years ago, where we showed that the commonest cause of community-acquired pneumonia in a patient admitted to a medical ward in a state hospital in KwaZulu-Natal is tuberculosis. So you can imagine any doctor working in this environment with poor control is going to be at risk of developing active TB. So there are things that we need to do to control TB, and if we don't do that, besides providing diagnostic and drugs, we will be in trouble. And my fear is that if the WHO makes these new TB drugs widely available, we will abuse them and we will rapidly get resistance and we will be back to square one. Okay, so things like natural ventilation. Again, I've shown you this before. If you just open this is a experiment where they took a medical ward and they infused carbon dioxide and they closed the windows, and that's the concentration of carbon dioxide. When you open the windows, see what happened. Immediately the concentration dropped, which shows that just natural ventilation would make a big difference to controlling the environment where we have a high burden of TB. Okay, so this is the ward picture I showed you earlier. And again, one of the ways in which we as healthcare workers drive the TB epidemic is we ask patients to expectorate sputum in the ward, and in fact that's one way of spreading TB. But we should have TB booths where the patient can go in and cough up the sputum in a safe setting. And these are very cheap, and we're looking at prototypes to market it more universally in South Africa, okay? And this is that's an experiment done in the US to look at ultraviolet light to sterilize the environment where there's a potentially high burden of people with TB. Okay, and then you already heard about totally drug-resistant TB. So if we don't keep our eye on the ball, you're going to lose sight of your TB control, okay? So the solutions, again, you heard from Dr. Christopher, is exactly the same around the world. And we have now widely implemented the gene expert. But do you know what's happening with the gene expert? Now every Tom, Dick and Harry is ordering a gene expert. The people don't seem to understand its application. So somebody gets active TB, the gene expert is positive, 2 months later they're repeating the gene expert. And they're wasting funds and resources. So we need to educate healthcare workers on how to treat TB properly. Okay. Now these are sanatoria that were set up to treat TB when we didn't have anti-TB drugs. Unfortunately, this is where we are with many of our patients with drug-resistant TB. And like I said, the challenge in South Africa is we've got too many patients out there in the community merrily spreading drug-resistant TB, when in fact we should actually protect the public good by keeping these people in sanatoria until they are no longer infective. Okay. And then there's a unique solution in Africa. This is the mouse that can smell TB. And in fact, there are several experiments being done, and they found that the mouse can detect TB infected patients much more rapidly than microscopy. So of mice and men, I think we've reached a point where we've gone to the rats, okay? And in fact, there's a big project in Mozambique currently underway. I think the WHO and the NIH is sponsoring the study. So we might actually be breeding mice to control TB. Thank you. So it's now my pleasure as co-chair to introduce Professor Xavier Blanc, who's going to talk to us on HIV and TB. He's published a Sentinel article on a study on HIV and TB, and we look forward to his insights. Over to you. And then we'll take some questions at the end if time permits.